In 2024, New Jersey was invaded by drones. The first sightings came over Picatinny Arsenal. But soon after, videos of lights in the sky began popping up all over social media. Reports became so widespread and numerous that local officials had no choice but to address the reasonable concerns that residents had. People wanted to know who was behind these mysterious drones, and there was no shortage of theories. It was a military exercise. It was a single nefarious hobbyist. Perhaps, most memorably, Congressman Jeff Van Drew claimed that
Iran launched a mothership probably about a month ago.
Despite the fact that the quote, mothership in question was confirmed to be in the Persian Gulf.
Very high sources, very qualified sources, very responsible sources.
Well out of the range of even the most powerful drones.
Oh, no!
Now, a few months later, with drone mania rapidly fading from our collective memory, the investigations are finished and the results are in. Many sightings were confirmed to be either hobbyist drones, manned aircrafts, or, most embarrassingly, stars. Just regular stars. This isn't the first drone sighting frenzy. In 2019, drones were sighted flying in grid formations over Colorado. And before we had drones, we had UFOs. The 1997 Phoenix Lights is a relatively recent example. And before UFOs, we had airships. In 1896, phantom airships were reported floating across California at night, thought to be built and piloted by some mysterious, wealthy industrialist. In 2024, it's admittedly harder to dismiss these supposed sightings. Not only are unidentifiable flying objects widely available to the public, but the phones that captured and shared these mysterious lights are a requirement of daily life. It's not our skies that have been invaded so much as our pockets. In 2047, Canada will be invaded by aliens. The proof will once again be on a cell phone.
Did you see the footage? Where do you think it came from?
This time, it'll be so much more than twinkling lights of dubious origin. It'll be red, headless giants. Occupants. So begins the game 1000xResist, released in 2024 by Sunset Visitor. We're about to get into major spoilers, so if you haven't played the game and you're forging ahead anyway, strap in. This thing gets crazy. Because the occupant's weapon of choice isn't really a weapon at all. It's a plague. You'll know you've caught the disease when you start to cry. You'll cry and cry until all the water has left your body, leaving a desiccated corpse. The virus will kill everyone, except Iris, a Canadian teenager whose parents are Hong Kong immigrants and survivors of the real-life 2019 violent protests there. They came to Canada to start a family, and they raised Iris to show no weakness, to never cry. Maybe that's why the occupants admire Iris. Like Iris, they came from a place very far away, one that they have no real ownership of. Just a memory and a legend.
There's a star, and a star, and a dangerous gravity.
They grant her immunity from the virus, but that only attracts the attention of a military organization, the 50. They tell her she's the only hope for mankind, but Iris doesn't really care. She's eager to escape her parents, especially her mother, who can be pretty cruel. But once they have her, the 50 run countless tests on Iris and even start cloning her. They eventually realize there's no hope for mankind, no cure. Iris is the only one that will survive. Iris takes one look at her clone, and she snaps.
I wish everyone here would just fucking drop dead.
Drawn to her rage, the occupants once again seek to help their chosen one, and Iris accepts their gifts. The occupants annihilate the remaining 50 and grant Iris immortality to match her immunity. And in exchange, Iris agrees to talk to him every once in a while. That's all. And since she's the only human left, Iris begins to procreate. She clones 5 daughters, all identical to her. They call her All-Mother, the mother of all that remains.
That remains and remains.
She gives each a function: a healer, a fixer, and a knower to maintain the library, as well as a protector, but they call her Bang Bang Fire. Iris lies to her daughters that they're all still at war with the occupants, and someday when they've won the war, they'll return to the surface. The 5th and youngest sister is named Watcher. Her function is to watch. Everything goes pretty well until one day Iris is betrayed. All-Mother abandons her sinful daughter. The details of this betrayal, this ancient sin, are unknown. But now, centuries later, Principal is in charge of the orchard. Sharing the gospel of All-Mother, Iris's absence elevates this Canadian teenager to godhood, and Principal remains to ensure all sisters shape in their domains and perform their functions faithfully. When a sister is deemed ready, a train comes for her. They're told it's time to join All-Mother in the fight against the occupants, and a new clone ascends to take this graduated sister's title: BBF, Watcher, Healer, Knower, or most recently, Fixer. Our current Watcher just lost her best friend, Fixer, to a trip on the train, and she feels her absence deeply. But Watcher must perform her function. And watching seems to involve 2 tasks. The first is to experience the life and times of the All-Mother firsthand. She does this through a technology called Communion, a kind of immersive full-dive VR type of experience where Watcher literally relives All-Mother's memories. Everyone inside the Communion sees Watcher as Iris.
Just the person I wanted to see.
And through these communions, we see the first few days of the invasion through Iris's eyes. We visit her school's infirmary, where a girl is worrying over her brother, the first victim in the school to fall ill. She worries aloud what'll happen when her parents hear about it, implying an unstable home life.
Please don't tell anyone it was him. We have enough trouble at home already.
We also meet who I assume to be the school weirdo. She's cooing over a pigeon she's found, airily reciting pigeon facts.
Pigeons are not wild. They're feral.
Watcher's second task seems to be to watch her sisters. In her first communion, the recently departed Fixer shows up. She says she's hacked into the communion to deliver Watcher a message. All-Mother isn't a god. She's abusive and cruel. She even conspires with the occupants. Watcher, however, won't hear any of this blasphemy. And at the first opportunity, she reports Fixer's betrayal. In this utopia, why would sisters harm each other? They're all the same person. That means the only crime to watch for is the ancient sister's sin, betraying All-Mother. So in that sense, Watcher is kind of a cop. For her crime, Fixer is promptly incinerated. And life goes on. A new Fixer is chosen. Before her inauguration, occupants attack the orchard. The cool blues and grays are replaced by a blaring red alarm system. Sisters lie dead on the floor. In a subsequent communion with Knower, Watcher learns the truth about Iris. She has been collaborating with the enemy, just like Fixer said. In communions, the very technology she uses to perform her function, a gift from the occupants. Fixer was right the whole time, and Watcher is furious. The dead sisters strewn across the orchard narrow Watcher's vision to one possible outcome. She boards the train and she assassinates her god. Watcher's act of political violence was motivated by learning the truth about All-Mother. But in a bigger sense, it's really the sum of all the communication Watcher received about her god. Learning the truth about All-Mother is only a betrayal after a lifelong education about a flawless god and a tireless fight against the occupants. If the communions pulled the trigger, the religious propaganda that all shells receive built the gun. In the game, one exquisite line foreshadows this interplay.
Language is an act of excruciating violence.
Hecky Almo, blue to red. Mask and bunker shield our head. All mothers dream from red to blue. Then sisters walk the earth anew. Heki almo 6 to 1. Each sister's function to be done. If function faithful sisters be, all mother grant immunity. But almo Heki love to hate. A sin does not incinerate. An ancient sister mother crossed. All mother's grace forever lost. Almo Heki hate to love. That sister's sin we are made of. From shell to sister, hair to hair. Cut it down from sphere to square. Each shapen sister her domain. Watch her, know her, heal her pain. Fire, fix what was profaned. And Heki almo once again. Every shell learns this nursery rhyme, recounting the history of the orchard. It's effectively a religious text, a gift from a literal god, and it's treated as such. A studious shell pores over each line, exploring alternate meanings, not unlike a biblical scholar. It's as though, confronted with the imperfection she sees in a society that's supposedly created by a perfect God, she's returning to this text, seeking alternate meanings to try to make sense of a contradictory reality.
Are you okay? Maybe you should get some sleep.
No, I'm fine. I'm really breaking through.
She explains that in writing this poem, every word chosen cuts away many words that were left unchosen. In that way, language is an act of excruciating violence. And the words chosen in this poem hold a lot of meaning for the shells. Not only is it frequently recited like a Pledge of Allegiance, but lines from the poem are often referenced in casual conversation. The game opens just before Watcher assassinates Allmother. Iris asks,
What is it that cannot wait?
And we, in our first act as Watcher, are given 3 dialogue options. Red to blue, 6 to 1, or hair to hair. 3 lines from this poem. As the player, we haven't even seen the poem yet, so this is all crazy nonsense to us. It's not until the studious shell explains to us what these lines mean that we can even begin to understand what the heck sisters are talking about when they say goodbye with a
Hair to hair, sister. Hair to hair.
definition seems straightforward enough, but then we witness it used in lots of different ways.
For me, it's a reminder to pay attention to even the smallest detail, and a reminder that everything that came before us is passed down through us, including the ancient sister's sin.
It can be an encouraging, keep at it, as easily as it can be an admonishment to pay closer attention to your work. At a play rehearsal, the understudy shell is practicing this line, and Watcher reflects that it could be read either meticulously or faithfully. Meanwhile, that studious shell defines 6 to 1 as
6 sisters: principal, fixer, healer, knower, bang bang fire, and watcher, all to serve the one, our great All-Mother. I take it as a rallying cry for our collective effort.
Though conversationally, 6 to 1 is more than just a rallying cry. It's a knowing wink and a nod from a bartender who just shared some gossip, as if to say, we're all family here, right? But it's also a stern reminder that, should you stumble in your function, Purple Shell, it's your responsibility to discuss this with Knower. The understudy shell muses that, as a line, it could be read as either begrudging, cynical, or selfish. And this semiotic flexibility is packed into all these phrases. Their varied meanings bound together by the same 3 words. There's so much more than proverbs from a religious text, though. They're part of a familect, invented phrases with highly specific meanings shared amongst relatives. It elevates the relationship between sisters beyond just their DNA, or even a parish all worshipping All-Mother, to a family. Sisters. 1000xResist is, first and foremost, about generational trauma. The scar left on Iris's parents by Hong Kong protests inadvertently leads Iris to leave her family, and Iris's own decision to leave affects her daughters in turn. The repeated nature of these phrases act as synecdoche for this theme. Hair to hair, 6 to 1. These are the words we have available to justify our actions, especially the cruelest actions. They're oral representations of generational trauma, repeated to one another to acknowledge the ways a difficult history affects daily life, and in some cases to keep passing that trauma down. In that way, language is once again an excruciating act of violence. But these phrases are also much more than just generational trauma. They're historical records, updated and adjusted as their meanings evolve over time and are passed down through generations. You can easily imagine the first time a sister said, 6 to 1, with a begrudging tone, shifting from the traditional meaning of all to serve the one, our great all-mother, to I'm frustrated that this is how I serve the great all-mother, and I'm sick of my stupid function. And suddenly, it has a new meaning. These phrases are records of not just the bad, but the good as well. They contain encouraging pep talks, the determined proclamations, the reassuring wisdom. Each subtle shift in meaning captures a moment a real sister experienced. The memory of the exhausted shell begrudgingly saying, 6 to 1, is now stored inside the phrase, summoned every time it's used with that same tone. However, while the impression is preserved, the details are lost. What kind of shell said it? Who were they? Why were they so frustrated? We'll never know any of that. But what if that impression could be preserved perfectly? What if the transfer was lossless? Communions are those perfect preservations of memories. Humans enter communion aided by one of the 3 conduits secretly gifted to Iris by the occupants. Watcher's conduit is named Secretary, and they're adorable. Secretary was created to allow Iris and the occupants to talk. Iris has this stupid, imperfect human memory, but with Secretary, she can summon perfect replications of any memory, even memories that aren't her own, and share them with whoever she's in communion with. It's through these summoned memories that she's able to communicate with the occupants, because they don't really have language like we do.
There is a decoupling of substances and a dangerous gravity.
They communicate by trading these perfectly replicated memories back and forth. It's a little hard to imagine how that would even work here in a video, just using my words. So the game instead shows us how it works through a puzzle game inside a communion. In this communion, occupants lay out memories we've already experienced from Iris's past, and they share a mysterious phrase vaguely describing their own history. And we, the player, must match one of Iris's memories to the phrase given by the occupants, as though we're pulling textbooks out of a memory to cross-reference each line they gave us. For example, we're presented with an image of 2 stars, now bright red dwarfs, dangerously close to one another. Beneath, we see that girl in the infirmary, fretting over her brother's illness and their unstable home life, and we hear her echo that line,
We have enough trouble at home already. Count yourself lucky.
The occupants share their mysterious line.
There is a star, and a star, and a dangerous gravity.
Our reference memory here matches what the occupants are trying to tell us. A dying 2-star system and a planet made inhospitable by the resulting changes in gravity. Not unlike 2 parents arguing, creating an increasingly inhospitable environment for their children. The occupants identify with this feeling of dread the girl's expressing when she refers to the trouble back at home.
Resonance.
The next line,
There is us, and we have a compass.
matches a vision of the pigeon girl who said,
Pigeons are homing. They always want to go back home.
and we conclude they left their dangerous 2-star system. A congruent vision of these 2 solar systems at a distance from one another confirms that suspicion. They began heading towards us, like a homing pigeon. And the next line,
There is a then and a creeping dispossession.
matches with Iris's mother as she talks about missing Hong Kong.
I dream every night of going back home, haunted by a place that doesn't exist.
Each successful match is met by the occupant's affirmation.
Resonance.
indicating that the line we've chosen is a metaphor for the occupant's history, that the two matched memories share an affect. The occupants may speak in an unyielding, cold tone, but they have feelings. They're just stored inside of memories as opposed to phrases from an old poem. And matching these sets of memories interactively in a game leads us, the player, to a greater level of empathy with their plight. How humans felt so foreign to them. How they used the virus to soak up the memories of everyone who died. How deeply they admired Iris. How they desperately wanted to connect with her. They do not refer to themselves as occupants. They call themselves keepers, protecting the earth and all the memories made there. It is perfectly preserved via lossless transfer. But for Watcher, learning all this doesn't change anything. Not the dead sisters back at the orchard, or the effective extinction of mankind. Lossless transfer? It's just another word for death. But for occupants, it's also the linchpin on which their communication turns, because language is an act of excruciating violence. In this faithful communion, when Knower sees the occupant's hands outstretched, offering the gift of communion through secretary, she wonders aloud to Watcher.
What could it be?
Watcher can answer a weapon, a device, or a friend. And all answers here are correct, but there's a name for the umbrella under which all these answers live. It's a medium. Just like how we use print, radio, movies, and TV to share stories with one another, communion's just the latest iteration. Experiential depictions of memory. Virtual reality meets a DVR, but for real life. The Assassin's Creed Animus is the closest point of comparison I can think of. I think we can all agree that controlling the media is a pretty powerful position. So gifting an entirely new medium of communication to a single Canadian teenager is a choice, but there's actually another Canadian with something to say about all of this.
It's obvious. The medium is the message.
In the 1960s, North America was invaded by the television. In 1948, only 1% of households in the US had a TV. 7 years later, it was 75%. That kind of adoption speed is bananas. Telephones, you know that thing in your pocket right now? Took 67 years to penetrate our lives that deeply. Marshall McLuhan, a writer, academic, and
that nut professor in Canada,
witnessed TV's meteoric rise. And he wrote extensively about how quickly and drastically TV changed culture. Suddenly, the living room, that room where you do all your best living, shifted to face the screen. Without really meaning to, television changed everything. As McLuhan put it,
the effect of TV, the message of TV, is quite independent of the program. That is, there is a huge technology involved in TV which surrounds you physically. And the effect of that huge service environment on you personally is vast. The effect of the program is incidental.
That's what he means when he said, the medium is the message. Another example, you might have heard the phrase, guns don't kill people, people do. But McLuhan says, no, actually, technologies do more than just enable humans. They create new tendencies within us. Merely existing with these technologies, or media as McLuhan loved to generalize, changes our behavior. Guns don't kill people, but they make it much easier to get killed, and seeing one sure changes the vibe in the room. New media, especially new communication media, pretty much always lead to big changes in culture. But what those changes are depends on the nature of the medium. So, McLuhan created a handy taxonomy. He broke media down into two categories, hot and cool, where hot media are high definition and low participation. Cool media are low definition and require high participation. So, telephones are cool. They're low definition because you're missing body language and the actual audio quality itself may be pretty bad. They require a high level of participation because they need you to listen really closely to interpret through the static or infer additional meanings from tone or maybe even imagine the body language. Meanwhile, radio is comparatively hot. It's higher definition because it contains more info. There's a lot of craft going into rehearsing the right tone, ensuring better audio quality. And you can trust that the radio professionals will provide descriptions or even sound effects where needed. Much of this imagining is done for you. And the hot and cool media push culture in two very different directions. Hot media, with its high-definition information, lets you off the hook. Its characteristic low participation leads to a more passive consumption experience. As a result, you're less intellectually involved in what you're seeing. And because you're less engaged and doing less meaning-making, you're less likely to reach out to other people to help you with that meaning-making, leading to more individualistic tendencies. And, at scale, a less collective society. Seem too extreme? Let's look at cool media instead, and this time use an example. Let's say you're having a cool telephone call with your best friend, and he's blabbing about, I
guess I just really feel like regional pizza cuisine is one of the most authentic American cuisines that we have.
And he says something that you totally disagree with.
I think for me, ultimately, my favorite is a nice white clam pizza. Love those clams.
You have the opportunity to stop him and tell him how wrong he is. That pizza sounds heinous.
Oh,
And that might launch a back and forth between the two of you.
You got it all wrong, Katie. You got it all wrong. I mean, the clam is so tasty and salty. And a little bit of sand in there. Keep you on your toes.
And now you're emotionally and intellectually engaged with
Katie,
one
just
another.
give it a chance.
You're doing some shared meaning making. This kind of interaction en masse leads to a more collective view of the world and a less individualistic culture. Television, McLuhan argued, was cool, while film is a big hot medium with high definition images that filled your field of view and surrounded you with sound. TV was kinda shitty. The screens were tiny, the speakers were crackly, and scan lines leave half of the image obscured, forcing your eyeballs into a high state of participation, filling in those gaps, even if you don't consciously notice it. You might flip the TV on in the middle of a program, and you'll have to apply yourself, infer what happened earlier in the show from context clues, heightening your level of participation in the viewing process. And the rapid adoption of this cool medium of TV, along with all of the other advances in the electronic age, meant that we were suddenly much more collective than we had been in ages. Maybe ever, as McLuhan put it.
In the electric age, when our central nervous system is technologically extended to involve us in the whole of mankind and to incorporate the whole of mankind in us, we necessarily participate in depth in the consequences of our every action.
There is a fundamental reordering.
He argued that the rise of cool media and its requirements for high participation were making everyone so collective that we were creating a global village. You now share a culture with not only your immediate family or your friends at school, it's everyone who watched that faithful shuttle launch in 1968. Or everyone who sat down for the final episode of Seinfeld, or everybody on the Lost fan theory forums. Many consider McLuhan's writing to be prophetic, as the rise of the internet intensified the feeling that we were all suddenly much more connected than we'd ever been. You now share a context with a much bigger group of people, and you might go to dinner and hear the strangers next to you also talking about what color that motherfucking dress is. That's a real story, by the way, that actually happened to me. The mediums we use can change the way our brains work. They cut us up and remold us without us even noticing. That makes pretty much all means of communication.
It's an act of excruciating violence.
We even have legends we tell each other to remind us how dangerously violent a medium can be. The most famous example happened on a cool October night. In 1938, New Jersey was invaded by aliens. Raymond Roccello's orchestra wafted through the radio and into living rooms across the Northeast. Suddenly, a news bulletin interrupts.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
A huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood.
A reporter on the scene described what he saw.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's indescribable. I can hardly force myself to keep looking at it. So awful. Oh, it's quiver and pulsate, and the monster or whatever it is can hardly... Now it's another one, and another one, and another one.
And soon enough, the invasion began.
They're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas spreading everywhere.
Listeners leaned in as the story unfolded, disturbed by what they were hearing. Some local radio stations reported a 500% increase in call volume. The local police station received over 2,000 calls. In the days that followed, accounts of the night's chaos were all over the papers. The New York Times recounted how 20 families rushed out of their houses, covering their mouths with handkerchiefs to flee poison gas they believed was entering their homes. And that's just one of countless stories. Though, in actuality, the invasion was fiction.
We made this one up.
What you heard was Orson Welles' Halloween production of War of the Worlds. Adapted from H.G. Wells' book from 1898, this radio play is, frankly, fantastic. Even my TikTok poison brain had me looking up from my game of Balatro as an exhausted voice warbles over the airwaves, awaiting an answer that will never come.
2X2L calling CQ. 2X2L calling CQ, New York. Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone?
This is Radio Verite, a hodgepodge of radio techniques that combine together to enhance the already immersive nature of radio storytelling. Characters will talk to each other to reduce the scripted feeling. Microphone feedback is intentionally included, as though the crew are distracted by the horror in front of them. Dead air becomes more and more frequent as the situation becomes dire. The overall effect is an impression of a nowness.
There's a nearness and its gravity is echoing.
I am the first to hear this, and I need to hear it. Radio Verite adds heat to an already toasty medium, so that it reaches out to grab us by the wrists, look us in the eyes, and say,
There's a you and an us and a means to us.
The nowness of Radio Verite and a story about an alien invasion revealed something. In 1938, on the eve of World War II, people were terrified. In the thousands of calls that night, not one person mentioned aliens. They were calling because they assumed the invaders were German. And it's not a huge leap. Wells' fictional broadcast bears a striking similarity to World War II correspondent Edward R. Murrow.
Just the sound of footsteps walking along the street, like ghosts shod with steel shoes. More searchlights are in action. We've not yet seen any burst of anti-aircraft fire overhead.
It doesn't sound so different than Frank Reddick's performance of a reporter witnessing an alien invasion.
What I can see of the object itself doesn't look very much like a meteor. At least not the meteors I've seen. It looks more like a huge cylinder.
The panic caused by this fake radio hoax got Orson Welles in some hot water. And even today, the story of the War of the Worlds radio play is still often cited when discussing radio regulations. But this story still bears some repeating because the thing is, it kind of kept happening.
In 1944, Santiago de Chile was invaded by aliens. In 1968, Buffalo, New York was invaded by aliens.
I found at least 4 other War of the Worlds productions that caused a local panic. Ecuador's broadcast is especially notable because on that occasion, the military was called in. Maybe to fight imaginary aliens, but more likely to control the riot setting fire to the radio station. While McLuhan would claim that the hot medium of the radio is to blame for these panics, there does seem to be something about this alien invasion story that gets under our skin. Consider how H.G. Wells begins the book.
Regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us, yet across an immense ethereal gulf. Minds that are to our minds as ours are to the beasts in the jungle. Intellects vast, cool, and unsympathetic.
The original book takes place in a peaceful English countryside, quickly destroyed by the aliens' superior technology. But just as quickly as the invasion happened, it ends. The pathogens that you and I and everything else on Earth are immune to kill the aliens just 3 days after their arrival. The book ends with a rumination on the magnitude of devastation caused in only 3 days. Setting the play near home gives the story an "it could happen here" vibe, and this resonated with English readers. The common sentiment was that UK's military was on the decline, and a story about England's speedy defeat rung true, though that's kind of the opposite reaction Wells was hoping for. Shortly after the line about the vast and cool intellects of the Martians, he goes on to make this comparison.
And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit?
Okay, well, pretty racist of Wells to call the Tasmanians an inferior race. Though his point remains. British colonialization of Australia was made possible by the genocide of the Tasmanian people. Can we really blame aliens for a little extermination of their own? This is how the British Empire regarded pretty much anyone who didn't look like them. And yet, people didn't really get the message. Instead of reflecting on how imperialism perpetuates war, it just made folks afraid of an invasion on English soil. It actually made them more interested in strengthening the military and gathering more resources from the colonies to do it. And the racism-powered engine of imperialism was still going strong in 1898 when War of the Worlds was published. In fact, you could say the story of 1000xResist, a tale about another alien invasion, begins that very same year. In 1898, Hong Kong was no longer being invaded. After 50 years of colonizing the region and not one but 2 opium wars, the British Empire forced the Qing dynasty into a rent-free 99-year lease over Hong Kong. It's an especially f***ed-up case of imperialism. Check this out. Silks and teas were in demand throughout the 1800s, and so the British Empire was desperate for trade access to China. But China took one look at what the English had to trade and said, "No thanks, we're good." So the British Empire started smuggling opium from India, that's another colony, into China through the port in Hong Kong. Because it turns out giving a population a highly addictive drug generates demand. But downside, an opioid epidemic is actually pretty bad for everybody not selling the drug. So the Qing dynasty fought back twice. And when that didn't work, exhausted and defeated, they gave up the territory. When people say stuff like colonialism is bad, this is the kind of shit they're talking about. But to be fair, once my country broke free of colonial rule, it got right to work on genocide and slavery, so... Aw, man, my glass house! To add insult to injury, when the British Foreign Secretary found out he now had Hong Kong, he was a huge jerk about it. He called Hong Kong
a barren rock with nary a house upon it.
Which is just the most imperialist sentence I've ever heard in my life. And sure, at the time, this rural fishing village was 7,000 or 8,000-ish people, but today, Hong Kong's home to over 7 million people. It's 1,000 times bigger now. This barren rock became a trade hotspot between East and West, and after a post-World War II boom, a manufacturing powerhouse. But Hong Kong was handed its identity by the British Empire. Hong Kong is a trade city, a shining example of the free market. But all this colonialism had some consequences. In Indelible City, Louisa Lim explains how colonialism shaped her education.
Anything British was mentioned in awed tones, but our teachers, who were European, were careful not to over-egg the pudding, lest we all decide to move to the United Kingdom en masse. In truth, what we were taught most thoroughly was whiteness, in particular, how to sound white and think white. At the same time, our education effectively deracinated us, suspending us in a kind of colonial non-space designed to ensure that we did not identify too closely with any place.
The overall effect was a generation of Hong Kongers raised without a sense of ownership over their history, and consequently, no collective memory, without the sense that
the us is a weave that can be unpicked.
When the 99-year lease expired, Beijing instituted a one-country, two-systems policy within Hong Kong. After the handover back to China in 1997, Hong Kong would have 50 years of relative political autonomy. Until 2047, they'd be a territory of China, but have their own rule of law. After a century of colonial rule, they could finally elect their own leadership. This was huge. A century of Western values imbued Hong Kongers with an admiration for democracy. And after the handover, things went relatively well for many years. Hong Kong had free press, local neighborhoods elected officials to represent them, and the big guy in charge, Hong Kong's chief executive, was chosen by an election committee made up of a mix of both people elected and Beijing-appointed representatives. But in 2003, things got tense. As part of the One Country, Two Systems agreement, Hong Kong was required to enact laws against treason towards China. Seems reasonable. One country, right? In 2003, the National Security Bill was introduced. It prohibited acts of treason, secession, sedition, subversion, and more. The problem is that, as written, the law was really vague. What counts as subversion? Is a reporter criticizing Beijing guilty of sedition? What about freedom of press? Or freedom of speech? That's why 500,000 Hong Kongers protested the bill to say, no, thank you. And it worked! The National Security Bill was withdrawn a bit later that year. The next decade passed without too much trouble. But by 2014, Hong Kong was 1/3 of the way through that 50-year agreement, and they still hadn't held a public election for that highest office, the chief executive. Anxieties were rising that there would never be an election. It felt like a step away from free and fair elections, like Beijing was trying to renege on its 50-year deal. Once again, Hong Kongers protested, this time over the course of 79 days. Almost 3 months. At least one survey showed that over half of Hong Kong residents supported these protests, even if they didn't participate. And can you blame them for staying home? Police began deploying tear gas to disperse protesters, but they stayed strong, protecting themselves with umbrellas. These protests became known as the Umbrella Movement, not only because the umbrella was a practical, non-violent protest tool, but also as an honest and simple wish to protect a Hong Kong determined by Hong Kongers. But the government didn't back down this time, and the Beijing-approved election reforms went through. The next and most violent protests occurred just 5 years later in 2019, this time over the extradition bill. This would allow anyone accused of a crime to be sent to Beijing. A pro-democracy advocate might be arrested for jaywalking and then sent to Beijing, where they would be unlikely to get a fair trial. Both local and global legal professionals expressed adamant concern that the bill would just be used to silence criticism rather than address actual crime. Again, it felt like Beijing was reneging on that 50-year agreement. So, again, Hong Kongers showed up to protest. 2 million this time. 1 in 4 people marched, demanding the bill's withdrawal. By July and August, protests turned violent. Tear gas gave way to rubber bullets, sponge grenades, and one time, live ammunition. In September, the extradition bill was withdrawn, but pro-democracy protests continued, demanding the release of jailed protesters, police conduct inquiries, and of course, that freaking election. Hong Kong wanted democracy. In November's election, pro-democracy candidates won across the board in an unprecedented landslide. But shortly after, in 2020, that national security law from 2003, it came back and was passed. All those newly elected pro-democracy officials, they weren't even informed. And then, pro-democracy candidates began getting disqualified from elections for their stance on Hong Kong's autonomy. Mentions of the Tiananmen massacre were removed from libraries, and protests were reframed as riots. Schools even stopped teaching in Hong Kong's primary language of Cantonese and began to teach in Mandarin, China's official language. Language again being used to control a populace, an act of excruciating violence. People saw the writing on the wall, and in 2020 alone, 89,000 Hong Kongers left the city for good. And in 1000xResist, it was 89,002. Two protesters that met after a violent police encounter. A young nurse was tending to a boy's newly broken nose when he asked,
Hey, 不如唔好講嘢啦，電話我。
A few years later, they would leave Hong Kong forever to start a family in Canada. They'd have a single daughter named Iris. The history of Hong Kong I gave you is biased. I tried to recount it from the perspective of Iris's parents, two pro-democracy protesters. There's so many stories left untold here. And on top of that, I'm just one well-meaning white lady who had a friend or two from Hong Kong growing up. But I've never actually been there myself. It's impossible for me to self-evaluate if I did a good job or not. Your respectful criticisms, corrections, and differing perspectives are more than welcome in my comments. My perspective is that of the rest of the democratized world, looking on in 2019 with solidarity and helplessness in equal measure. In a blog post about 1000xResist, Castell Please writes how their Chinese-Indonesian experience struggles to incorporate what's happening in Hong Kong and how they thought the history of Chinese life was going to go.
Since childhood, I have fantasized about the reunification of Chinese people around the world. We were all orphaned by our histories, but as China and Taiwan opened their doors to each other, we came into contact with relatives we thought had disappeared. My late grandfather in Jakarta met his younger brother in Taipei, and I remember tasting local delicacies in Meizhou. I lived in Shenzhen and visited Hong Kong. It felt like we were all becoming one happy family, even though our history was full of bloodshed. We're finally regaining our sense of a Chinese community.
This is cool because it's a vision for the future. And don't we deserve to determine our own future? Isn't that the promise packed inside the phrase, one country, two systems? But today, for many Hong Kongers, that promise is broken. How can you determine your future when the past feels like it's slipping away? How can you know where you're going when where you've been is shrouded in mist?
I dream every night of going back home, haunted by a place that doesn't exist.
I haven't told you about Zhao. Zhao and her mother emigrated to Canada much later than Iris's family. After her father died, it's implied he was killed while protesting. Zhao admires Iris and relies on her help to assimilate to Canadian life.
But you are my, 怎么说? Role model.
Iris's mother loves Zhao. They share fond memories of Hong Kong and lament how everything closes so early here. Iris, meanwhile, finds Zhao annoying and needy. She's jealous. Zhao has a relationship with her mom in Hong Kong that Iris can never have. And that jealousy manifests as cruelty. Cruelty that Iris can easily justify because that's how her mother taught her. And anytime Zhao tries to stand up for herself, Iris retreats to language. Zhao came from a different place Iris has left. Her schools taught Mandarin, not the Cantonese spoken by Iris's family. While Cantonese and Mandarin use the same characters, they're as different as Spanish and French. Zhao knows both languages, but her Mandarin is much stronger. Occasionally, when she doesn't know either the Cantonese or the English word for something, she'll fall back on Mandarin. This never fails to irritate Iris. And of course, Iris uses Zhao's less than native understanding of English to make sure she feels less than, using language as an act of excruciating violence. Remember those phrases taken from Allmother's poem? 6 to 1 and hair to hair? They reminded me of something that happens when I talk to my Chinese-speaking friends. We'll be gossiping, and sometimes they'll stop to say, "Oh, there's this perfect Chinese saying for this, but I don't know how to say it in English." And then they'd share a phrase and try to explain it. Most recently, from my Mandarin-speaking friend,
冤家路窄.
It literally means enemies meet on a narrow road. Or, very literally, enemy, person, road, narrow. And it references the narrow streets in old Chinese city that would force you to confront whoever was walking the other direction. It works in tons of different situations, too. Say you run into an old roommate that you hated living with years later. You might say, "Ugh, not you again." Or,
冤江路窄.
And if you're talking to your friends and you notice your ex just walked in, you'd say, well, look what the cat dragged in. Or, again, same phrase.
冤家路窄.
And this is just one of hundreds, maybe thousands, of the specific kind of idiom called a chengyu. In the same way that 6 to 1 is a 3-word phrase from a poem and contains numerous meanings, these 4-character chengyu are all taken from history and literature, like poems, and they contain a multitude of meanings. Though, as a native English speaker, my perspective here is again super limited. Huge thanks to the Lee family who helped me out with this section. I'd be curious to hear from Mandarin and Cantonese-speaking people in the audience. Does this feel like an apt comparison to you? And also, I'd love to learn some cool Chengyu or any other clever Cantonese or Mandarin idioms. Please share your faves. It also reminds me of that super bitchy British foreign secretary who called Hong Kong a barren rock. They proved him mega wrong. So today, Hong Kongers have reclaimed the phrase barren rock as a nickname for their home, and it's used in a variety of ways, both optimistically proclaiming that Hong Kong can always meet any challenge, or pessimistically watching emigration rates rise as the city becomes less democratic.
There is a then and a creeping dispossession.
1000xResist seeks to tell the story of an old Hong Kong, a place that no longer exists. Zhao, of course, didn't survive the occupants' invasion, but when Iris left home, she stole Zhao's diary. Centuries later, that diary would resurface. One of Iris's original 5 daughters, the first Watcher, found it after a day of being bullied by her sisters. And though Iris forbade her sisters from making their own clones, young Watcher found a strand of Zhao's hair in the diary and thought, well, it's not a clone of Iris, so that's not against the rules, right? Besides, I think seeing an old friend again would be a great birthday present.
But it wasn't.
As a punishment for her sin, Iris condemned her youngest daughter to remain alone in the orchard. She was sentenced to cloned sisters from her own hair. This was the ancient sister, and centuries later, she would grow up to be principal, in charge of an orchard with many, many sisters, all cloned from her hair. And she had a plan for revenge. She learned how to manipulate communions and make alterations to the memories shown. When our Watcher began to perform her function, Principal put her plan into action. She showed Watcher the worst of Allmother, inserted a fake transmission of desperation from Fixer, revealed the Allmother's treason, and orchestrated an apparent occupant attack at the exact right moment, all to push Watcher over the edge. After Watcher assassinated Allmother, Principal arrived to see the fruits of her plan. The tyrant is dead. She goes to her dying mother.
You have no idea how I missed you.
Watcher is captured, tortured, and blinded. Her function literally ripped from her eye sockets. Her torturer? Nowhere. All the while, she's coolly observed by Noah's closest confidant, a creepy blue shell that, back in the orchard, always seemed to regard Watcher with contempt. Noah trades in her purple colors for the red garb of the High Minister, and that observant shell sheds her blue colors for a shiny silver. Watcher nicknames her Mauve, maybe because the blue shell seems to have taken on some of the purple hue of a knower, or perhaps because Watcher recalls the color from one of her communions. Mauve, the color of disinterest. Noah keeps insisting she's only doing what's best for Watcher, what's best for everyone. After years alone and lost in the dark, Watcher hears a scuffle, and then a familiar voice. It's Fixer! She's still alive! And Healer and BBF too! They're here to free her! Noah, still claiming that she's doing what's best for everyone, invites her sisters to smack her with a wrench so that she can let them take Watcher while retaining her position in the new hierarchy. Back at the orchard, a new government has emerged. The All-Mother's theocracy fell away, and in its place, an authoritarian government led by Principal. Jow clones are brought back, and they're considered an adorable little novelty to the irises. They live to serve. Below, in the old subway station, lives a lower class of shells that have yet to earn colors. Some even begin to choose names for themselves. With Watcher indisposed, we, the player, find ourselves in the shoes of one of these shells. Her name is Blue, and she wakes from dreams about an old orchard where escalators aren't manned by armed guards, a place that doesn't exist. These dreams make her an outcast. Her only lifeline is her apprenticeship to a barkeep, that same barkeep who gossiped with Watcher before a knowing valediction. Blue is drawn to this link to the past, but the past is an endangered species, and Bartender is murdered. Officially, it's deemed a suicide, though Blue knows better. Distraught, she turns to an extremist cell and begs for justice. They give her a job. With the help of the Jows, some older sisters, and shockingly Mauve, Blue executes a terrorist attack. She bombs a play. She does not intend to survive, but she does. Bang Bang Fire, of all people, rescues her and takes her to the other fugitive sisters, and she finally meets the woman she's been sharing dreams with. But Watcher's condition is quickly declining. That would explain the fractured nature of some of these dreams. Or communions, rather. They've been communions the whole time. One of these glitched out communions occurs while Blue is escaping the orchard. She's thrown helplessly through time. As the Red Guard chases her through the orchard, she has visions of the Hong Kong police lobbing tear gas at protesters, umbrellas strewn across the street. And it's unavoidable. 1000xResist is desperately reaching out, grasping towards you, trying to tell you Hong Kong's story. It tells Hong Kong's story in language. When Zhao struggles to find a Hong Konger's Cantonese word that Iris can understand and instead uses Beijing's favored Mandarin. It tells Hong Kong's story through empathy when we play as Blue in Old Town, a place transformed into a recreation of a typical Hong Kong street. We find ourselves literally walking a mile in the shoes of a Hong Konger. It tells Hong Kong's story through food and culture, as we listen to Iris's father explain the special bamboo noodles he made for his vegetarian daughter, or quote Bruce Lee. It tells Hong Kong's story with humor. In Iris's high school, the student council is paralyzed by what to do over a huge fox statue. I see it as a mirror of the budding Hong Kong government just after 1997, unsure how to enact democracy, represented as a bewilderingly large fox statue, but believing fervently in it.
The past councils wanted this. Someone believed in this fox statue.
Meanwhile, other members roll their eyes.
I bet none of these elites have ever even seen a fox.
Referencing a Hong Kong that's never been led by an elected official. 1,000 years later, a fox skull in the orchard darkly hints at what became of all that discussion. Nonetheless, the skull is reverently laid at the shrine. Dead, but still vaunted. It tells Hong Kong's story in allegory. an airborne virus that forces tears like tear gas, an invader bathed in red and adorned with a halo of golden stars, a towering figure who you call occupant but calls themselves keeper. They desperately love you and believe they understand you and know what's best for you, but they're unable to communicate with you. Despite the pain and suffering caused at the hands of the occupants, I found 1000xResist to be at least a little sympathetic to their perspective. It tells Hong Kong's story in reference. When Blue is reunited with the separatist leader, who gave Blue that terrorist mission, she holds an umbrella over her head, in reference to the umbrella movement and the homemade explosives increasingly desperate protesters began turning to. And it tells Hong Kong's story with violence. The assassination, the torture, the bombing, all features of political unrest. The bombing haunted me. We see why Blue goes through with it. We meet all her allies and hear all their reasons for supporting this extreme act of violence. I see their helplessness. They have no voice in their government, and there are simply no other options. Though on the other hand, the game doesn't hold back showing us the cost of violence. Blue kills at least as many sisters as that occupant attack, all innocent. Not to mention the Zhao who willingly and knowingly stood by Blue just so she wouldn't die alone. But Zhao didn't survive, and Blue did. Through violence, metaphor, humor, food, culture, empathy, and most loudly through language, 1000xResist seeks to tell the story of Hong Kong, a Hong Kong known by people just like Iris's parents, and a Hong Kong that can never be known to Iris or any other children of the diaspora because it's a place that doesn't exist. As Karen Chung puts it in her memoir, The Impossible City,
"It is not Hong Kong that has died, but the imagination of the place we were promised in 1997.
A broken promise, made all the more tragic because Hong Kong never truly owned its history, never got to tell its own story, a fate shared by the sisters stuck under Principal's authoritarian rule. The Watcher has a solution. When she finally meets Blue, she explains, a mass communion. Bringing the 3 secretary-type devices together will allow Blue to host a communion with all the sisters in the orchard at the same time, and then everyone will finally learn the truth. The truth about the occupants, the truth about Iris, and the truth about Principal. A mass communion that will restore a history long obscured by those in power. A single broadcast. Though we've already talked about how dangerous some broadcasts can be, haven't we? Especially when broadcasting with a brand new medium. Let's dig a little deeper into the longer-term effects of Orson Welles' broadcasts to try to really understand just how dangerous a medium can actually be. In the days after the War of the Worlds broadcast, newspapers would report endlessly about the riots and the panics and the insanity that ensued. But a lot of that supposed freakout was also made up. That story I told you about neighbors running out of their houses clutching a rag to their mouths to avoid poison gas? There's no evidence it actually happened. And the same could be said for countless stories of mass hysteria that newspapers reported on. The mass panic was as fake as the radio broadcast itself. And yet, the legend of this broadcast continues. I made a poll asking you if you'd already heard this story, and 88% of you had heard some version before. We tell it again and again just to emphasize the dangerous power contained within not just radio, but any medium of mass communication. I first heard it in a class I had to take before hosting a radio show to scare me straight about spreading misinformation over the airwaves. But the perpetrator of this supposed crime, Orson Welles, actually kind of benefited from this broadcast. 12 years later, he started claiming that the whole broadcast was a knowing and dire warning about the power of radio. Listen, I love Orson Welles, but I don't think he foresaw all this. I think he was just leveraging the outrage as evidence of his supposed genius. And CBS, the broadcasting company, they were just as bad. They cast themselves as ground zero for the chaos, cementing their importance in the history of media with anthology series like The Night America Trembled. But the very first group to take advantage was the newspapers. In 1938, print was rapidly losing ground to radio as the most common source for news. But a fake radio broadcast, that changes everything. The papers took the opportunity to point a finger and say, "You can't trust these crooks, only a fool would listen to the radio." Multiple publications drew direct comparisons between the radio play and Hitler's use of radio to control the flow of information to Germans. Not to mention these sensational stories about US Americans losing their shit over fake aliens. It sold papers. So it was all a big hoax, right? A scam, even. Everyone involved walked away with a few more dollars in their pocket, and the American public is left with a sense of dread when they turn on their radio. But then again, remember how I said this happened 4 other times? So, while it's a hoax, it's hard to dismiss this myth's value as a cautionary tale. But surely today, with the internet, this wouldn't happen. This is all just the magic of radio verite, and maybe even just a radio thing. Today, people would go on social media and they'd figure it out.
Iran launched a mothership.
While not the result of a storyteller's actions, the parallels between the December drones and the War of the World story are disturbing. There is no drone threat, just like there was no Martian threat, and the false information was primarily spread over a rapidly dominating new media. Both panics were widely reported on by an older medium, desperately clinging to relevancy, and both panics were accelerated by pre-existing global instabilities. The biggest difference is that this kind of mass panicking happens with such frequency nowadays that you probably don't even remember the drones anymore. There's always something new to be panicking about. The myth of Orson Welles' radio play persists because it contains within it a truth about our relationship with technology.
The panic myth is a function of simple displacement. It's not the Martians invading Earth that we fear. It's ABC, CBS, and NBC invading and colonizing our consciousness that truly frightens us.
We may never be able to quantify the danger a new medium poses. Its impact will always be greater than we know how to measure, track, or even understand. But this War of the Worlds myth captures our shared fear of that unknown invader, the radio, or the TV, or social media, or even communion. So when we see a desperate and incoherent watcher insisting that a mass communion to everyone will liberate sisters from principles authoritarian government, there's reason to be wary. After all, it was Watcher's communions that convinced her to assassinate Allmother. The thing is, when Blue finally executes that mass communion, it kinda works. We see the first communion, one Iris shared with her original 5 daughters. It's a vision of Hong Kong, peaceful, towering, verdant, bustling. The live-action shots could have been B-roll, but they're placed front and center in this chapter, playing in reverse, an impossible wish to reverse time, to return home to a place that doesn't exist. Before I asked you, how can you determine your own future when the past feels like it's slipping away? How can you know where you're going, where you've been is shrouded in mist? 1000xResist answers that question with communion. Each and every sister is gifted that lost history, the stories they never knew, shown that place that doesn't exist. So it's reductive to try to claim a communion, or any medium, is all good or all bad. What's more effective and important than assigning some sort of moral value to each medium is to recognize how powerful they are and how they work. That's what McLuhan gifted us with his catchphrase, "The medium is the message." And he attempted to provide a few tools for better understanding their impact on us with his hot-cool taxonomy. So are communions hot or cool? Do they engender collectivist or individualist mindsets? Well, it's hard to deny the high definition of the information they present, suggesting that they're a hot medium. But they also demand this really high level of participation, what with the walking around and the talking to people and the switching between time periods. So that's like a cool medium. But then again, they propel Watcher to assassinate the All-Mother, which seems pretty individualistic, very hot media coded. But then again, she's driven by an increased awareness and compassion for the society she lives in, gained through her time in communion. And she's usually sharing her communion with one of her sisters, so that's all pretty cool medium collectivist type behavior. Okay, so that actually didn't really clear anything up. Instead, let's consider how the medium is the message. In Chapter 1, Fixer tells Watcher everything she's about to learn in the rest of the game. Watcher's reaction to that message is to sell her out to the authorities. But when Watcher gets that same exact message through a communion, through experiential transmission of traumatic memory, she's radicalized. Noah also talks about how Watchers, the only sisters who regularly participate in communions, are emotional and reactive, almost as though receiving these traumatic memories confer Iris's millennium of trauma she's been accruing. And accessing her parents' memories confers the trauma of all of Hong Kong with that. The communion is both a fantasy of a perfect preservation of that place that no longer exists, and a dystopia where we're never able to heal from the traumas our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents took on so that we could live. But communions aren't real. Hong Kong's diaspora is very real, but these characters are imagined. We'll never know exactly what it feels like to take on that trauma transferred through perfect replication of memory. If only a medium existed that places you in the shoes of another person so you can live out their experience in a directed but detailed way. Oh yeah, video games! McLuhan passed away in 1980, so unfortunately he never had the chance to play E.T. and proclaim that video games are either hot or cool. And as much as I would like to summon McLuhan from his grave with calypso music a la Weekend at Bernie's 2, we'll have to settle for the next best thing. In 2019, Stephen Conway and Mark Ouellette wrote Playing It Cool, considering McLuhan's hot and cool taxonomy for game studies. They argued it's reductive to call all games either hot or cool. An FPS is hot, they argued, because it's high definition. You're taking in high density of information around your surroundings, looking for any hint of an enemy, and all that information is rapidly communicated to your trigger finger. The FPS is then also low participation, they argued, because your actions are limited to shoot and move. Conversely, a walking simulator is cool. It's comparatively low definition as you're plopped into a space with little context about why you're there or what the rules are. But this requires a higher participation on your part as you begin making your own meaning about the story. Though I disagree, I think that's also reductive. What about when you play an FPS with your friends? Maybe you start as the underdogs and then you finally get that first win. That's a narrative that you're building together and it requires that shared meaning making. It's a cool media suddenly. Meanwhile, a walking simulator story is predefined and transmitted through dialogue and cutscenes that require less participation. You might make a choice or two that has some impact on the outcome, but there's no shortage of literature about how disappointing it is when those choices don't have enough impact. So I'd argue we need to look at a specific game and its ludonarrative interactions to understand its McLuhan temperature and how it's impacting us. In 1000xResist, you'll spend your time doing one of three things. In Chapter 1, we use a time-shifting mechanic to access blocked-off areas, leading to a sense of progression and mystery throughout the chapter. The gaps between time periods and snippets of conversations lead us to infer what happened here and participate in our own meaning-making. This mechanic is used less spatially and more rhetorically during the test the occupants give us, where we go back and forth between different conversations in order to match them with the story the occupants want to tell us. However, barring these two chapters, the gameplay utility of this mechanic is underutilized. Most often when you're time shifting, it's like turning pages in a book. You're not intended to go back and forth to do your own meaning making. meaning is handed to you one line at a time. The second thing you'll do is navigate these platforming sessions. They aren't especially challenging. You navigate from waypoint to waypoint, satisfyingly around the map, but it's never especially engaging to figure out where to go next. At the end of the game, there's a timed platforming section with a fail state, and it was a pretty simple hurdle to clear, at least for me. So overall, this ends up lowering my sense of participation. The third and biggest portion of the game is wandering around the orchard, a space designed by Sunset Visitor as a compound of different liminal spaces. It's an inspired aesthetic choice, as these spaces create a contradictory affect of nostalgia and alienation, not unlike the sense a Hong Konger might get moving through the city today. Familiar in so many ways, but radically different than it was even a decade ago. The way they patchworked these very different spaces together leads to a lot of bizarre and confusing architectural choices. It's a disorienting 3D space to try to navigate, and you're definitely going to get lost. That time spent wandering is by necessity high participation. Even though a later version of the game patched in a map, it's just a child's drawing and therefore very low definition. It took me until the end of Chapter 4 to build an accurate mental map in my head. Then, in Chapter 6, it's all turned on its head. Principal's provisional government has made a lot of changes to the orchard, completely upturning that mental map I had painstakingly memorized. My ability to identify with the space is under attack. The claustrophobia is emphasized by the ever-present armed red guard, always standing by to handle dissent. I find myself missing the old orchard, a place that no longer exists. So, within the game, there exist both hot and cool tendencies. When time-shifting sections are used for storytelling, it's hot, but when they're used for gameplay, it cools it back down. The low participation platforming is hot, but the high participation navigating around the orchard is very cool. 1000xResist is both a hot, narrative-heavy experience with high-definition information, also a cool, highly participatory experience where we're forced to draw our own conclusions about what it's like to mourn a place that doesn't exist. What we have here is a thermal grill illusion, a plate made up of alternating hot and cool strips of material. If you put your hand on it, it'll trick your brain into thinking you're in terrible pain. It's a real thing. Here, I'll show you how to make one. All we need is some hot dogs, a bowl of ice water, and a microwave. Cut the hot dogs in half, plop them in the ice bath for, like 20 minutes, and then put the other half the hot dogs in the microwave. Then alternate hot and cold hot dog halves on a plate. Now, all you have to do is trick someone into touching them. Hey, Catburger.
Yes, Katie. Ooh, my favorite treat. Several halved hot dogs all laid together. Well, I'll just lay my paw upon it.
And?
Yeah! Oh, Katie, that hurt. Wait, did it hurt?
By alternating hot and cool hot dogs across your mind, 1000xResist keeps your attention heightened and fixed on the screen, leaving you with the sense that what you're watching right now both demands your full attention and your full participation. The result is a more immersive experience that asks you to make your own meaning and draw your own conclusions. You know what else is a thermal grill? Social media, especially social media about drones. An endless stream of information constantly pouring in about these dangerous drones, mixed with the ever-present, highly participatory demand that you should comment and share and click that subscribe button. Incidentally, while we're on the topic, do you guys mind clicking that subscribe button? It really helps out the channel. Thank you. Okay, bye. For December Drones, the War of the Worlds broadcast, and 1000xResist, the invasion being presented has a nowness to it. Either metaphorically or directly, the invaders represent a fear of a foreign threat born of a real geopolitical instability. However, there's a key difference between these examples. The War of the Worlds broadcast is a cautionary tale, and the December Drone saga fills me with dread and doubt my fellow humans. So why does 1000xResist fill me with hope? The difference is in the ending. By New Year's, pretty much everybody had gotten bored and moved on from the drones. Meanwhile, 1000xResist, a human-designed experience, mindfully guides you to an intended ending, where you're met with perhaps the most participatory section yet. The game ends by asking you personally, could you define the future of the human race, please? In Impossible City, Karen Chung asks,
You are Asia's world city, an international financial center, an inalienable part of China. The government tells us, the foreign press tells us, Beijing tells us. But if we cannot rewrite our origin story, can we at least reimagine our future?
The mass communion gifted every sister a history. And with that history and the context of everything that came before, the occupants asked Blue to make a choice. Secretary has convinced the occupants that we're better off without them, so they'll leave soon. But before that happens, Blue has to decide who will join us in that future, and whose journey ends here.
There is a choice, and we will not make it.
11 different groups of people, all standing under streetlights. Our ending depends on who stays and who goes. No pressure. There are some right and wrong answers for the best ending. You must save the fugitive sisters, Healer, Fixer, and BBF. Mostly because the deep sea ship the Orchard's been on for the past 1,000 years is starting to fall apart, and Fixer's the only person who even cares about going to the surface. If we don't take them with us, we're met with a bleak scene of shells laying down and dying, giving up. There's a parallel here between the ship slowly falling apart and climate change catastrophes making our planet less habitable. We need to figure out some way to survive, and if we don't, well, that's just like lying down and giving up. You also have to save the Jows. They've been cloned, they're here now, and they've been given a pretty raw deal for the past 1,000 years. If we choose not to save them, we get an ending called Justice for Jow. Blue is on her hands and knees, racked with guilt, unable to go on. Leaving the Jows behind is tantamount to genocide, eliminating half of genetic diversity left on planet Earth. And it's effectively killing Iris's truest and most loyal friend. If we need fugitive sisters to save our bodies, then we need Jows to save our souls. Jow always deserved better, and it's our responsibility to give her a chance for that better future. There's also some groups that you have to leave behind. The Red Guard, the provisional government's police force. If you keep them, they'll line you up against the wall and their loyalty is to the provisional government, and you just executed a plot against said government, so their next move is obvious. Is any organization that is this doggedly devoted to maintaining a broken status quo worth saving? Wouldn't they always, by definition, work against any progress that doesn't serve those in the highest echelons of power? A reasonable counter-argument might be, okay, well, who keeps the peace? To which I would say, these magical aliens are letting me specifically, define my ideal utopian future. Why does Utopia need cops? Mauve must also be left behind. If you keep her, then the moment you wake up from the mass communion, she pops you in the head. Mauve desires
change, no matter the change, and no matter the cost.
She wants to completely eliminate the old ways. And to that end, she's worked tirelessly to push the current social system to its breaking point. And she's been pretty successful so far, but she's not done yet. Blue just initiated a mass communion in order to restore history to her sisters. That's kind of the exact opposite of what Mauve wants. A clean slate with no history. However, Mauve's clean slate has no vision for what life could be like in that future. She's looked on at the events of the game with nothing but disinterest. She looks to the future with that same disinterest. If the point of this section is to envision a future, how can we work with someone who doesn't care what that future looks like? Other than that, we get free reign. Do we bring the memory of Iris's parents and the Hong Kong protests with us? What about the older sisters who are a little stuck in their ways but have wisdom to share? Maybe I'm a pack rat, helplessly trying to stuff a whale into a backpack, but I kept pretty much everybody else. Even Principal seemed like an obvious yes to me. She was so clearly just a wounded animal lashing out. She shouldn't be in charge, but she demonstrated a deep, authentic regret for her actions, and she'd already suffered so much. I had to give her a second chance, and I feel like the game rewarded me for that. The person I could not forgive was Knower. Knower showed no contrition or even awareness of her sins. She seemed just to serve whoever had the most power in the moment. And when she had actual power, she was too concerned with keeping it to actually make any meaningful change. One of the first things Knower says to us is,
"There is no feeling so strong it's worth getting incinerated over."
And every action she takes demonstrates that principle. And I agree, we shouldn't go throwing ourselves on the pyre the first chance we get. But I also feel like utopia needs to be fought for. There is no room for someone who stands for nothing. Mauve deeply admired Knower and fully adopted her worldview for a while. The only difference is that Mauve took Knower's philosophy of self-preservation to its logical conclusion. If you stand for nothing, let there be nothing. Destroy everything. Those are the conclusions I came to, but a lot of good that does Hong Kong. A lot of good that does New Jersey. A lot of good that does me trying to understand Marshall f***ing McLuhan. In the stupid real world, there's no streetlights I can turn on and off. There's no great hand of God coming to catch us. So what's even the point of this little exercise? Maybe you think I chose wrong. You're already typing in the comments. Really? You kept everyone else? Even those guys? What kind of— And to you, cruel commenter, I say, good. The medium is the message. Making these choices for yourself is the point. That's the magic of games as a medium. And that's why 1000xResist had to be a video game. It demands you personally, imagine a future. And even though out here in the real world, we don't have the mandate of magical aliens, the future is still in our hands in 1000 times different ways. But that can be overwhelming. Today, the media we consume is a thermal grill Gom Jabbar. Right now, you're letting my voice in all its high-definition glory fully consume your auditory senses. Hot dog! At the same time, I'm gonna ask you to participate. Like, comment, and subscribe, please. That helps the channel. Now that you're commenting, we're doing something together. A cool Frankfurter against your forehead. But the next hot dog in our Gom Jabbar is a hot algorithm that starts immediately suggesting what to watch next, lowering the participatory barrier to the next piece of media. Hot, cool, hot, cool, hot, cool, hot, cool, hot, cool, hot, cool. I can't fix the future. I don't know how to prevent the next social media freakout. I definitely can't resolve the question of Hong Kong's independence. I sure as heck can't make a fully descriptive model of how the various new medium we consume affect us, whether it's social media or games or imaginary new mediums invented by aliens. I feel like my brain is being invaded by hot and cold hot dogs, and I can't tell if it hurts or not. And that's why I don't have a conclusion. Instead, I have one last twist. I told you the story of the War of the Worlds radio play, a myth that keeps folding back on itself. First, I told you there was mass hysteria, and then I said, no wait, actually, that was all made up. Well, I have another actually for you. On that cool October night, there was some small concern about an invasion. People weren't running through the streets or anything, but the switchboard did actually light up with calls from concerned citizens. It just didn't escalate that far beyond phone calls. Many of those calls were to neighbors. Folks saying, hey, you hearing this? Do you think this is real? Folks checking in on each other. Are you okay? Do you have enough food? Some calls to the police were from doctors, wondering if they needed extra medical help. The real truth of the 1938 War of the Worlds radio play is not a chilling example of how easily we can be tricked, but a testament to how we cannot help but care for each other. Fixing the future can feel hopeless Like no message can penetrate the thermal grill. But together, we can shape in any imaginable future. And communion is closer than you think. Thank you so much for watching the whole dang video. It really does mean a lot. Liking and subscribing is a great way to support the channel, so thank you very much if that's something you've already done. A special thank you to my brave and generous patrons who are on the screen right now. Becoming a patron for $5 or $10 a month is the #1 best way to support these big honkin' essays. If you can swing it, that is. At $10, you'll get a handwritten thank you note with stickers inside. And my patrons mean a lot to me. So much so that I like to wish them a happy birthday when I can. Speaking of which...
Hello, I'm Whoosh, and I came down from space. I traveled for miles to put a smile on your face. Yo,
Diego.
Happy birthday. You're cool. My home is Mars, and the trip is long, but it's worth it to sing you this birthday song. Yo,
Diego.
Happy birthday. You're cool.
Everybody wish Diego a happy birthday in the comments. You're all implicated now. Okay, see you next time.
I'm implicated.